Welcome to the Buddhist audio bookshelf YouTube channel, where we're delighted to have you back. In today's session, we'll be delving into the enlightening wisdom of two captivating chapters from Noble Conversation, a study guide authored by the Venerable Thanissaro Bhikkhu. Join us as we embark on a journey through Chapter 7, the third Noble Truth, and Chapter 8, the fourth Noble Truth. Chapter 9, Pondering the Truth. These profound teachings shed light on the core principles of Buddhism, offering insights and guidance for a more meaningful and harmonious life. We invite you to support our channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing our content. Your simple actions play a vital role in motivating us to continue our dedicated efforts in sharing these teachings, which can bring profound benefits to all beings. Thank you for being a part of our community, and we look forward to this enriching exploration together. Now let's start with Chapter 7. The Third Noble Truth. The third noble truth is the truth of the cessation of suffering. The term cessation here doesn't refer to the fact that suffering, once it arises, ordinarily has to pass away. Instead, it denotes the absolute ending of any and all stress and suffering that arises from craving. The way the Buddha defines this truth points out the basic strategy for how this cessation is brought about. You attack the problem at the cause. It's like going into a house and seeing that it's full of smoke. Instead of trying to put out the smoke, you try to find the fire causing the smoke, and you put that out. The smoke will then dissipate on its own. In fact, this third noble truth is defined in a way that shows that it's identical with the act of fulfilling the duty with regard to the second noble truth. It's the remainderless cessation through dispassion, giving away, giving back, release, and letting go of that very craving. In this sequence of terms, dispassion, viraga, can also mean fading. Suffering ceases when passion for the chain of events causing it fades from the mind. The terms for giving away, giving back, and release kaga, paminasaga, and muddy refer to the fact that the mind, in acting on craving, lays possessive claim to it. To abandon craving, it has to abandon its claim and return it to nature. You see that even your cravings aren't worth viewing as yours, so you give them their freedom. The final term in the sequence, letting go, analaya, also carries the connotation that you let go with no sense of nostalgia for your cravings. You cut off the relationship entirely, with no lingering regret for what has ended. Other passages in the canon describe the dispassion and cessation of the third noble truth as the foremost phenomenon that can be experienced. There is no phenomenon higher than this, ID 90. Your duty with regard to this truth is to realize it. In other words, you not only abandon craving, but you're also fully aware of how you do it, and of the results that come when you do. As we noted in the preceding chapter, to develop dispassion for craving, you also have to develop dispassion for the processes of sensory experience on which it focuses. Because these processes are fabricated through your intentions, and because acts of fabrication are rooted in desire, and 1058, when you develop full dispassion for that desire, these fabrications cease as well. This means that all the processes around the six senses cease, at least for the duration of the experience of gaining awakening. The mind discovers a dimension that is totally separate from the six senses. As the canon says, this dimension is not mediated by the six senses at all, and yet it can still be known, SN 35-117. Even when, after you gain awakening, you return to your experience of the six senses, you experience them disjoined from them. Because you no longer try to feed on them, you allow them their separate existence, Minnesota 140. Now, because language is a fabricated phenomenon, this unfabricated dimension can't be properly described by words. Nevertheless, the Buddha needed to give some explanation for why it would be a good goal to aim for, and some indications of how to recognize it once attained. That's why he described it indirectly through metaphors, nibbana, unbinding being his metaphor of choice. In ordinary Pali usage, the term nibbana was used to describe the extinguishing of a fire. To understand the implications of this image, though, we have to understand how the Buddha described the physics of how fire worked. Individual fires, he said, were caused by provoking the fire property, which existed, in a calm latent state, to a greater or lesser degree in all things. When you provoked it, say, by using a fire starter, it would grab hold and cling to the fuel that would sustain it. Here, for fuel, the Buddha used the word upadana, the same word for clinging feeding that he used in the definition of suffering in the First Noble Truth. As long as the fire burned, it was trapped in a state of heat and agitation. When it went out, it let go of its fuel, grew calm, and was released. The Buddha used the term unbinding for the goal, both to indicate that it was a state of freedom, and calm was another metaphor he used for this state, and also to suggest how to get there. Just as fuel doesn't cling to the fire, it's not the case that the aggregates cling to you. You're the one clinging to them. You gain freedom by letting them go. The main difference between the nibbana of the fire and the nibbana experienced by the mind is that the fire property can be provoked again, and so give rise to other fires. The release of the mind, though, is said to be unprovoked. Nothing can provoke it into clinging to anything ever again. The Buddha also uses the metaphor of an extinguished fire to make the point that the person who has gained release can't be described. Just as a fire, when it goes out, can't be described as going east, west, north, or south, in the same way, a person fully released can't be described as existing, not existing, both, or neither. That's because people are measured and defined as beings in terms of their attachments. When they have no more attachments, they can't be defined, and so can't be properly described. The Buddha was very rigorous in never describing the state of the person fully awakened, although he did give an image to indicate that such a person lies beyond the limits of language. Such a person, he said, is immeasurable like the great ocean. As for nibbana as a state, there's a paradox in how the Buddha talks about it, although the paradox can be easily resolved. In the passage in which he describes dispassion as the highest unfabricated phenomenon, or object of the mind, he lists the realization of nibbana as a synonym of dispassion. In other passages, though, he indicates that nibbana isn't a phenomenon at all, it's the end of phenomena. We can resolve the paradox by noting that because the act of realizing nibbana is an action, it would count as a phenomenon. But nibbana as a state is beyond all actions, which is why it's the ending of all phenomena, whether fabricated or not. Still, the Buddha had to give his listeners some sense that nibbana was a desirable goal. This is why he described it with many positive metaphors. These metaphors can be divided into 5 classes to give an idea of why you would want to unbind. 1. Unbinding is experienced as a type of consciousness. This consciousness is said to be unrestricted, without surface, and unestablished, meaning that it makes contact with no object at all, not even consciousness itself. The Buddha illustrates these terms with a simile. A beam of light that lands on no surface anywhere, causing nothing to reflect it. Unlike the consciousness aggregate, consciousness without surface isn't known through the 6 senses. This is why unbinding is said to be subtle and hard to see. Yet because this consciousness is a form of knowing, the Buddha states that it's a mistake to say that fully awakened people do not know or see. In other words, awakening is not a blanking out. Actually, awakened people know and see to such a heightened extent that they're beyond even the need for conviction in what the Buddha taught. Consciousness without surface is also unlike the consciousness aggregate, in that it's totally outside of space and time. This is why the Buddha states that it contains no coming nor going nor staying in place, as these activities would assume time, and that it has no here nor there nor between the two, as these concepts assume space. Existing outside of space and time, this consciousness is without end. 2. The second aspect of unbinding is its truth. Because it's unfabricated, it doesn't change into anything else. Ever. After all, it's outside of time. This is why the Buddha calls it undeceptive, unwavering, permanence, ageless, undelaying, deathless, unbent, i.e., not tending in any direction, and true. Because unbinding is a state, pada, rather than a being, satta, it doesn't have to be defined by attachment, so the canon doesn't hesitate to say that it unequivocally exists. There's even one passage where the Buddha calls it the highest noble truth. 3. The third positive aspect of unbinding is that it's the ultimate sukha, a term that can be translated as pleasure, happiness, ease, or bliss. Unbinding, as experienced in this lifetime, is invariably described as pleasurable. It's bliss, the exquisite and the unafflicted. Just as consciousness without surface is totally apart from the consciousness aggregate, the bliss of unbinding is totally apart from the pleasure that comes under the feeling aggregate. Given that unbinding is unfabricated, it has no need for nutriment, which means that its bliss has nothing lacking. So the fully awakened person is said to be hunger-free. And because this bliss is known independently of the six sense media, it's not affected even by that person's death, which is why the Buddha calls unbinding peace, rest, the secure, security, island, shelter, harbor, and refuge. 4. However, even though unbinding is pleasant, fully awakened people don't cling to this pleasure, so they're not limited by it. They're said to be beyond both pleasure and pain, and also free. Free from the slightest disturbance or limitation, free from fabrication, free from the fires of passion, aversion, and delusion, free from passion for dispassion. And as noted above, free even from the confines of space and time. Because locations come from craving, and because unbinding is free of craving, it doesn't count as a place at all. For this reason, those who fully attain it are said to be everywhere released and everywhere independent. Like the light beam that doesn't reflect off of anything, they can't even be located. For these reasons, the fourth positive aspect of unbinding and the one most emphasized in the canon is that it's total freedom. This freedom is indicated in a general sense by the Buddha's two most common epithets for unbinding: the term unbinding itself and release. Because, in line with the underlying metaphor of the extinguishing of fire, freedom comes from letting go, the remaining epithets for this freedom focus on the fact that unbinding is free from all the clinging defilements that cause suffering and stress. It's attachment-free, free from longing, the ending of craving, dispassion. It's purity. And as the Buddha indicates, the freedom of a person whose mind is released is no different from the freedom of the Buddha himself. 5. In all the above aspects, consciousness, truth, bliss, and freedom, unbinding excels everything that there is, so its fifth aspect is its excellence. There's nothing to equal it, much less to exceed or surpass it. The Buddha calls it the amazing, the astounding, the ultimate, and the beyond. Chapter 8. The fourth noble truth. The fourth noble truth is the path of practice to the cessation of suffering. It's true in the sense that it's a genuine possibility it can be done, and it really leads to suffering's end. Of the four noble truths, it's the one you deliberately make true through your actions. It's why the teachings on karma and freedom of choice are so essential to the Dhamma. This truth is the one that shows their power to do the greatest possible good. In his first talk, the Buddha introduced this path of practice as the middle way because it avoids two extremes. 1. Indulgence in the pleasures of sensuality, and 2. Devotion to the pain of self-torment. Yet this does not mean that the path pursues a course of middling pleasures and pains. Instead, it fosters the pleasures of concentration, along with insight into the pain of clinging, and treats these pleasures and pains not as ends in themselves, but as tools to achieve a higher end: the deathless. The path, however, doesn't cause the deathless. After all, if the deathless were caused by anything, it wouldn't be unconditioned. Instead, the path leads to the deathless in the same way that a road to the Grand Canyon doesn't cause the Grand Canyon to be, but following the road can take you there. The path is composed of 8 factors. Because these factors work together to achieve the goal of the noble search, the path as a whole is called the Noble Eightfold Path. The factors are all said to be right in that they're effective in reaching the goal of awakening. The Buddha illustrates this point with a simile. There's a right way and many wrong ways to try to get milk out of a cow. If you pull on the udder, that's the right way, because it accomplishes your aim, you get the milk. If you twist the cow's horn, that's a wrong way, because it doesn't get you the milk that you want, and it harasses the cow. In the same way, Following the factors of the path is the right way to attain the deathless. Following their opposites would be wrong, because they wouldn't get you there. Like suffering and its causes, the factors of the path are directly experienced, although you need some training in the Dhamma before you can bring them about. The factors are these: right view, knowledge with regard to the Four Noble Truths. This means not only knowing the truths, but also knowing how to use them to classify experiences. On top of that, it also means knowing their duties and how to follow them. Right resolve, being resolved on abandoning thoughts of sensuality, thoughts of ill will, and thoughts of harm. Right speech, abstaining from telling lies, intentionally misrepresenting the truth, speaking divisively, to break up friendships between other people, or to prevent such friendships from forming, speaking harshly, with the purpose of hurting another person's feelings, and engaging in idle chatter, speaking with no clear intention in mind. Right action, abstaining from killing, stealing, and engaging in illicit sex. Right livelihood, abstaining from any ways of making a living that are dishonest or harmful, or that aim deliberately at giving rise to passion, aversion, or delusion within oneself or others. Right effort, generating the desire and carrying through with the effort to prevent unskillful states from arising in the mind, to abandon any unskillful states that have already arisen, to give rise to skillful states that are not yet there in the mind, and to develop fully any skillful states that already are. Right mindfulness, mindfulness on its own means the ability to keep something in mind. Right mindfulness, in the most general terms, means keeping in mind the need to abandon unskillful qualities and to develop skillful qualities so as to get the mind into right concentration. This entails being able to recognize skillful and unskillful qualities for what they are when they arise, recognizing as another function of mindfulness, and to keep in mind the most effective ways to complete the work of abandoning or developing, as is appropriate. To keep these tasks in mind, mindfulness needs to be established in a frame of reference. These frames are four: the body in and of itself, feelings in and of themselves, the mind in and of itself, and mental qualities in and of themselves. The in and of itself here means observing these things simply as they are without reference to their meaning in the context of the outside world. To be established on any of these frames, you have to do two things. 1. Stay focused on the frame, and 2. Put aside any thoughts of greed or distress with reference to the world. For instance, to stay focused on the breath while dropping any thoughts about issues related to the world outside is one way of staying focused on the body in and of itself. To notice the feelings that arise from staying focused on the breath as they happen would be a way of staying with feelings in and of themselves, and so forth. To stay established in these frames of reference, mindfulness needs the help of two other qualities: alertness and ardency. Alertness keeps you aware of what you're doing in the present moment and of the results of what you're doing. Ardency is essentially the same thing as right effort, the wholehearted effort to stay mindful and alert, and to do what is skillful in line with the directions given by mindfulness. When mindfulness is well established in this way, it forms the theme of the last factor of the path. Right concentration. Stages of mental absorption, called jhana. There are four. The first jhana is composed of pleasure and rapture that come from temporarily abandoning sensuality and other unskillful qualities, and directing your thoughts to a single object such as the breath. At the same time, you evaluate how to adjust the mind and the object so that they fit snugly and smoothly together. The resulting feelings of pleasure and rapture are then allowed to spread throughout the entire body. The second jhana is composed of a stronger sense of pleasure and rapture that comes when you no longer need to direct your thoughts to the object or to evaluate it. In other words, you stop talking to yourself about it and you can simply enter into a concentrated sense of oneness with the object. Again, the pleasure and rapture are allowed to permeate and to fill the entire body. The third jhana is composed of a sense of a more refined physical pleasure and mental equanimity that come when you no longer need to feed off the sense of rapture. This pleasure, again, is allowed to fill the entire body. The fourth jhana is composed of a sense of equanimity and purified mindfulness, coming from the ability to let go of pleasure and the subtle stress that even refined pleasure entails. The in and out breath grows still as the body's oxygen needs are reduced, and the body is filled with a bright, clear awareness. In Chapter 11, we will discuss how these 8 factors of the Noble Path work together to attack the problem of suffering at its cause. The 3 forms of craving. Here we will simply note that these 8 factors fall under 3 headings. The first 2 factors, right view and right resolve, comprise the discernment group. The next 3, right speech, right action, and right livelihood, the virtue group. And the last 3, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, the concentration group. For this reason, the path is sometimes called the triple training. In heightened virtue, heightened mind, concentration, and heightened discernment. The duty with regard to this fourth noble truth is to develop it. The canon suggests 2 ways in which to do this. The first is to develop the factors in sequence. You start with a mundane level of right view, which affirms the principles of karma and rebirth. Your actions, bodily, verbal, and mental, come from your intentions. They have results that correspond to the quality of the intention, and those results can take widely varying lengths of time to be felt. Some are felt immediately, others may not be felt until future lifetimes. Based on this level of right view, you follow the first of the Buddha's 2 categorical teachings, i.e., the teachings that are true across the board in all situations. Unskillful actions, bodily, verbal, and mental, should be abandoned, and skillful actions should be developed in their place. As you follow this teaching, you become sensitive to how unskillful mental actions lead to suffering, whereas skillful actions relieve suffering. You then refine this insight into the nature of action by adopting the view that mental acts of craving lead to the clinging that constitutes suffering. Right here, you see further that the causes of suffering should be abandoned, and the path to the end of suffering should be developed. This view inspires you to resolve on using right view in the right way, not as a mere topic of discussion or argument, but as a guide to action. As a first step in that direction, you resolve on abandoning unskillful qualities in the mind. Then you try to carry out this resolve in all your activities, as you make an effort to speak, act, and find your livelihood in ways that harm no one. Not yourself, not others. In trying to be skillful in your external actions, you also need to be skillful in how you engender the mental qualities motivating your actions. This entails right effort. At the same time, keeping in mind the need to be skillful in both external and internal actions requires that you develop the qualities of mindfulness, alertness, and ardency that will help in the practice of right mindfulness. You come to see that the most skillful mind states free of thoughts of sensuality, ill will, and harmfulness are the stages of right concentration. So you work to establish mindfulness in a way that will give rise to those stages. The close connection between right mindfulness and right concentration is shown in passages in the canon that equate rightly established mindfulness with the first jhana, and in other passages where mindfulness is said to be purified on reaching the fourth jhana. The second way to develop the path is also sequential, but a bit more complex. As you develop each path factor, the 3 factors of right view, right mindfulness, and right effort circle around that factor. Of the 3, right view comes first in seeing the distinction between the right and wrong versions of the factor. Right mindfulness remembers to develop the right version and abandon the wrong version. Right effort makes the effort to carry through with the instructions of right view and right mindfulness. The fact that both of these methods for developing the path start with right view can be explained by the Buddha's insight into karma on the night of his awakening. The skill or lack of skill in your intentional actions derives from the views that inform them. In this case, the Noble Eightfold Path is the highest form of karma, the karma that leads to the end of karma, and right view is what leads the way in performing all the duties connected with the noble truths. Comprehending suffering, abandoning its origination, realizing its cessation, and developing the path. But as we've also noted, once right view and the other path factors have been fully developed and done their work, they too have to be abandoned. After all, the path is fabricated. The Buddha calls it the highest fabricated phenomenon, whereas the goal is not. This means that the path is not present in the goal. So the path actually entails two duties: developing the factors so that they can do their work, and then abandoning them when their work is done. As we'll see in Chapter 11, right view is particularly well suited to provide the lead in performing this double duty. It teaches you to look at your views, less in terms of their contents, and more in terms of the karma of clinging to them. In other words, it sensitizes you to views as actions. The motivations lying behind them, the suffering inherent in clinging to them, and the long-term consequences of holding to them and acting on them. After right view applies this analysis to other views, showing you how to abandon them, it's in an ideal position to apply the same analysis to itself. Here it's important to note that even though awakened people abandon the factors of the path on gaining awakening, when they return to the realm of the six senses after awakening, they still can make use of the qualities of mind developed in the course of following the path. Their virtue, concentration, and discernment are perfected. In fact, impeccable virtue in terms of the 5 precepts is one of the signs of a person who has achieved even just the first stage of awakening. Still, those who are fully awakened no longer have to develop the path factors for the sake of doing any further work on their own minds. This is one of the ways in which the Noble Eightfold Path counts as the karma that puts an end to karma. However, even though right view leads the way in achieving these results, it can't do the work on its own. It needs to be trained by the act of developing the other path factors. Right concentration, for instance, is needed to give the mind a solid foundation of well-being that allows right view to be resilient in comprehending suffering. Right resolve and right effort make right view more perceptive in the strategies needed to undercut unskillful motivations in the mind. This means that the path factors are not always developed strictly in sequence. And, in fact, the canon lists a variety of ways in which the discernment of right view follows on the other path factors. For example, when the Buddha sets out the triple training, he puts virtue first, followed by concentration, and then by discernment. So even though right view may lead the way, as explained in the analysis of the path, it's also true that the act of developing the other path factors gives important practical lessons to right view, deepening its understanding of all the noble truths and of how to perform the duties appropriate to them. We'll explore some of these practical lessons in chapters 10 and 11. The fact that discernment is nurtured by the development of the other path factors is also reflected in the Buddha's list of 3 types of discernment: the discernment gained through listening to the Dhamma, the discernment gained through thinking it through, and the discernment gained through actually developing the qualities that the Dhamma recommends developing. When you've learned the Buddha's step-by-step discourse and the 4 noble truths, you've gained some of the discernment that can come from listening, and you've taken your first foray into the second main step in awakening to the truth. Having found a truthful teacher, you've now heard the Dhamma that teacher has to teach. The next step is to gain the discernment that comes from thinking the Dhamma through. Chapter 9. Pondering the Truth. As the Buddha explains the steps to follow in awakening to the truth, once you've heard the Dhamma, such as the teachings of the step-by-step discourse or the 4 noble truths, you try to remember it. Then you try to penetrate the meaning of the words. Once you understand them, you ponder them until you find that they make sense. This is called coming to an agreement through pondering the teachings. The purpose of all this thinking is to give rise to the desire to put the teachings into practice. The Buddha notes that it's possible to listen to the Dhamma with the purpose of finding fault with it, interpreting it in ways that make no sense, but that defeats the purpose of listening to it in the first place, as a step in putting an end to your suffering. Although he doesn't ask you to put your critical faculties aside as you listen, he does advise you to use them wisely. Instead of pouncing on what seems not to make sense as proof that the Dhamma is wrong, you think and then ask questions of the person teaching the Dhamma to gain clarification whenever you can't resolve your own doubts. As the Buddha said, he trained his students in cross-questioning, asking the meaning of whatever isn't clear so that they could allay their doubts, and then that they be willing to be cross-questioned, too, so that they could help allay the doubts of others. This means that part of the onus is on the teacher to present the Dhamma in a clear and convincing manner, and to be patient in clearing up points you find unclear. But part of the onus is also on you, the student, to bring the right attitude to the process of trying to make sense of what the teacher has to say. The right attitude is composed of the two qualities that the Buddha said he looked for in a student: that you be truthful and observant, but it also includes a third: that you bring an attitude of goodwill. 1. When you're truthful and observant, it helps you to understand clearly why you might be holding to any views that are getting in the way of accepting the basic principles of the Dhamma. 2. When you bring an attitude of goodwill for yourself, it helps you to see that you would benefit from abandoning those views. At the same time, when you bring an attitude of goodwill for the Dhamma and for those who teach it, it motivates you to look for ways of resolving any conflicts you might perceive in the teachings. Let's look at these points in more detail. The canon shows that the Buddha had to deal with many people who rejected the Dhamma on the grounds that it didn't fit in with views they already held. Their major issues centered on the fact that the Buddha's two categorical teachings on the need to abandon unskillful actions and develop skillful actions, and on the Four Noble Truths, didn't fit in with their views about the world and the self. Some, for instance, believed that the self was powerless to act. Others believed that actions were unreal. Others, that the world was totally chaotic, following no laws of cause and effect. For them, a path of action that would result in the end of suffering would be impossible. Now, as we noted in Chapter 6, world and self are the basic concepts of becoming, and becoming is precisely what the Four Noble Truths are designed to end. This means that, from the Buddha's perspective, those who had trouble accepting the Dhamma had the context backwards. They were trying to fit the Four Noble Truths into the context of becoming as they understood and clung to their ideas of self and world, whereas he had formulated the Four Noble Truths as the context for showing how any type of becoming came about as a result of a process, and how that process could and should be made to cease. To show that he was operating in a different context and that they should, too, the Buddha often refused to take a stand on the hot philosophical issues of his day that fell within the context of becoming. Some of these issues concerned the nature of the world. Did the world exist? Did it not exist? Was it eternal? Not eternal? Infinite? Finite? Was it all one? Was it a multiplicity? Will all the world gain awakening? Will a half? A third? Other issues that he put aside concerned the nature of the self. Is there a self? Is there no self? Do I exist? Do I not exist? What am I? How am I? Am I basically good? Basically bad? Is the self the same as the body? Is the self one thing and the body another? After death, does an awakened being exist? Not exist? Both? Neither? Some of these issues the Buddha put aside on the grounds that they were irrelevant to the practice. Trying to answer them would simply squander time better spent on putting an end to suffering. Other issues he put aside on the grounds that however you answered the issue, it would stand directly in the way of the practice. For instance, with the issue of the self, the Buddha noted that however you defined yourself, you would be placing limitations on yourself, limitations that would get in the way of the practice for awakening. To begin with, if you assert that you have a self, no matter how you define it, you'll naturally cling to whatever you define as self, and that clinging will prevent you from putting an end to suffering. On top of that, specific ways of defining your sense of self would place additional limitations on you as well. For example, if you define yourself around your physical body, there's the problem that the body doesn't exist in unbinding. That would mean that if you gained awakening, you would be annihilated, an idea that would discourage you from practicing. Similarly, if you defined yourself as nothing more than a conditioned being, you wouldn't be able to know anything unconditioned, and that would mean that an unconditioned end of suffering would be beyond your ken. If you defined yourself as interconnected with all other beings, that would mean that no one could gain awakening until everyone gained awakening. From that, it would follow that the Buddha was never awakened, and that you, on your own, could never put an end to suffering, either. If you tried to get around that problem by defining all beings as already awakened, simply that they don't realize it, the problem is that beings are still suffering, which means that awakening would not mean the end of suffering. On the other hand, if you decided that you and all other beings have no self, that would place limitations on you, too. You wouldn't be responsible for your choices, which would make it impossible to embark on any path of practice at all. At the same time, there would be no one to benefit or be harmed by your actions. That idea would encourage irresponsible actions and discourage you from making the effort to follow the path. These are some of the reasons why the Buddha avoided taking a position on many of the controversial issues around self and world that excited his contemporaries, and that still excite many people today. Now, it's not the case that the Buddha refused to take a position on all the philosophical issues of his time. He did take a stand on issues of karma and rebirth, and the truths about suffering and its end, because these gave clear answers to what he saw was the primary issue: how to know which actions are skillful and which are not. It's just that he was radical in claiming that this particular issue should override all others. So if you find yourself having trouble fitting the teachings on karma or the Four Noble Truths into your views about yourself or the world, the problem is that you've got the context backward. Instead, you should see how your views about yourself and the world fit under the Four Noble Truths. However, to reverse the context with issues like these isn't easy. After all, your sense of self and world deals with your perception of what really is. It's hard not to cling to what you see as real. Fortunately, the Buddha gives guidance in how to loosen your grip. This is where the qualities of truthfulness, goodwill, and being observant come in. In terms of truthfulness and goodwill, you may remember from Chapter 2 that a major aspect of your truthfulness as a person is expressed in how truthful you are in citing the basis for your opinions. In the case of the monastic discipline, this means truth in citation. Being clear about the status of the evidence you bring when accusing a fellow monastic of misbehavior. Is it based on what you saw, what you heard, or only on what you suspected? In a similar way, the ability to loosen your grip on your opinions about the reality of the world and the self requires that you examine your basis for holding them. As the Buddha points out, they may be based on conviction in someone else's authority, such as the authority of a religious teacher, a text, or a scientist, or they might be based on what you like, on analogy, or on what you feel has been well reasoned. When you examine these reasons, though, you realize that they don't count as direct knowledge. They're nothing more than hypotheses. They could be true or they could be false. When you realize how tenuous the evidence is for any view about the world or the self, it makes it easier to put that view aside. If you don't really know whether the end of suffering is possible, why choose a hypothesis that would close off the possibility that it could be true? If you had goodwill for yourself, you'd want to adopt any reasonable hypothesis that leaves that possibility open. As for being observant, the Buddha suggests that if you hold to a view that conflicts with the Four Noble Truths, you should examine your motivation for holding to it, and the actions that result when you act on it. Why hold to a view that denies the power of your actions to put an end to suffering? What allure does the view hold for you? Why do you like holding it? Does it lead you to do things that are skillful? Or does it discourage skillful behavior? For instance, as the Buddha points out, if you don't believe that you have the power to choose your actions, if you think that you live in a world totally predetermined by physical laws, there's no motivation for exerting yourself to be skillful in what you do, say, or think. So what incentive would you have for holding to that view? Being truthful with yourself in answering these questions corresponds to the two other types of truthfulness discussed in Chapter 2 in connection with monastic discipline: truth in observation and truth in reporting. You're true in accounting for your inner motivation for holding to a view, and you make an extra effort to accurately perceive the actual results of the actions inspired by the view. Again, when you can be truthful with yourself in these ways, it makes it easier to show goodwill for yourself and to put the view aside. In all these cases, being truthful in citing the source for your view and being observant about the motivation for and karmic results of holding the view, you've also begun to reverse the context. You've learned how to take the issue of skillful and unskillful action and give it priority over concepts of self and world. Adopting this context also makes it easier to resolve conflicts you might perceive in the Dhamma. That's because most of these conflicts come from getting the context wrong, trying to fit the Buddha's two categorical teachings into the context provided by his other teachings. But when you realize that the categorical teachings provide the context into which the other teachings should fit, the perceived conflicts go away. A case in point concerns the Buddha's teachings on self and not self. When he says that all phenomena should be seen as not self, he seems to be making a metaphysical assertion. There is no self. But then there are passages where he states that the self is its own mainstay, and that you should take yourself as a governing principle in order to stay on the path. This sounds like he's being inconsistent. If there's no self, how can you rely on yourself to be a mainstay or a governing principle in any way at all? Some people have tried to resolve this apparent inconsistency by proposing that the Buddha spoke on two levels of language, ultimate and conventional. On the ultimate level, there really is no self. However, on the conventional level, the unreflective level of ordinary everyday language, there is a self. But this explanation simply compounds the problem. If there really is no self, then when the Buddha talks of the self as its own mainstay, he's employing a useful fiction in his terms, a beneficial falsehood. But as he himself indicated, in his eyes there is no such thing. A better way of resolving the conflict is to see how the teachings on self and not self fit into the context of the Four Noble Truths. We can begin by recalling that the Buddha's attitude toward truths expressed in words. They're instrumental. They're true to the extent that they really work in bringing about the aim for which they're formulated. They're consistent with one another to the extent that they act together in bringing about that aim. This means that, in the case of concepts of self and not self, we have to consider how they function on their own, and how they function together to arrive at the end of suffering. It's because of this emphasis on function that the Buddha put aside questions concerning whether the self does or doesn't exist. Instead, he looked at your sense of self and of not self as perceptions, i.e., actions. In other words, his teachings on self and not self weren't intended to answer such questions as, does the self exist? Do I exist? Rather, they were intended to answer the questions that the Buddha said lay at the beginning of discernment. What, when I do it, will lead to my long-term harm and suffering? And what, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? Applied to issues of self and not self, these questions become: when do these action perceptions lead to long-term harm and suffering? And when do they lead to long-term welfare and happiness? As you recall, the Buddha's analysis of the perception of self comes in the context of becoming. You adopt a sense of self as agent, consumer, and commentator as a strategy for achieving happiness by attaining the object of the desire around which the becoming coalesced. The agent is what does the actions to get the desired result, the consumer enjoys the result, and the commentator judges how well the agent has acted and recommends future improvements. As it so happens, the concept of not self is also implied in that strategy. Anything that's irrelevant to these functions or stands in their way is regarded as not self. When we divorce the sense of self from metaphysical issues, in other words, when we don't concern ourselves with pinning down exactly what the self is, or if it is we're left with perceptions of self and not self as negotiating strategies for happiness, centered on what they do. And as the Buddha noted in his second recorded talk, a primary aspect of what a self does is that it exerts control. You label as self whatever you find to be worth trying to control to bring about happiness. This applies most directly to the self as agent as it tries to control events in the mind and the world outside, but also to the self as consumer and commentator. The self as consumer tries to possess and hold on to whatever happiness the self as agent finds for it. The self as commentator gets feedback from the self as consumer, and then uses that to try to influence the self as agent. Conversely, the perception of not self is also related to the concept of control. You label as not self whatever can't be controlled or you decide is not worth trying to control, so that you can focus your efforts for control on areas where they will give the best results. So the choice to apply either of these perceptions comes down to a value judgment. What's worth trying to control and what's not? Because this value judgment will change according to circumstances, your sense of self will change over time, as will your sense of the line dividing self from not self. This is how these concepts function in ordinary states of becoming, and it's also how they function on the path to the cessation of suffering. As we've noted many times, the fourth noble truth is a path that's fabricated for the sake of achieving an unfabricated goal. For that reason, it carries two duties, performed in stages. First, it has to be developed. Then, when it's been developed and completed its work, it has to be abandoned, so that the unfabricated has nothing standing in its way. As it turns out, one of the main factors of the path, right concentration, starts as a state of becoming on the level of form. This means that developing the path will require developing a state of becoming, which in turn entails a sense of self in all of its three roles. The self who's capable of following the path and giving rise to right concentration. The self who anticipates benefiting from following the path, and the self who comments on how well the path is progressing, and how it might be further developed. As for how true these perceptions of self might be, the Buddha notes that states of becoming don't lie under your total control, because they're composed of the five aggregates. If you could totally control them, they wouldn't entail suffering. However, even though you can't exert total control over the aggregates, you can control them to the extent of using them in fabricating right concentration, and all the other factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. So to whatever extent your perceptions of self help you to succeed in developing those factors, those perceptions are true. As for perceptions of not self, while you're developing the path, you apply these perceptions to anything that might pull you off the path. This would include any attachments that might tempt you to engage in wrong speech, wrong action, or wrong livelihood. It would also include any thoughts that might distract you from right mindfulness or right concentration. However, when the path has been fully developed, and right view has succeeded in developing dispassion toward craving for all other things, that's when your duty with regard to the path is to abandon it. You see that your sense of self, which you adopted as a strategy for happiness, is now the only thing standing in the way of the highest happiness. It no longer serves the purpose for which you developed it. It's because of that insight that for the sake of the even greater happiness promised by the third noble truth you strategically apply the perception of not self to all fabricated phenomena, the path included. Then, to make sure that you don't try to cling to the experience of the deathless that's revealed when all fabrications have disbanded, you apply the perception of not self even to the unfabricated, and then you abandon that perception, too, to be free of any trace of the terms of becoming. That's how the path leads beyond fabrication to the all-around ending of clinging, and the total end of suffering. So when we put the teachings on self and not self in their proper context as strategies for happiness in general, and as tools for completing the duties of the Four Noble Truths in particular, we see that they contain no contradiction at all. There's no need to assume two levels of language in the Buddha's teachings, and no need to doubt that we can take him at his word. What he said was always true and beneficial. It's up to us to know how to use his words, so that they're timely in our practice. This, of course, is only one example of how you might resolve your doubts about specific teachings in the Dhamma, but it underlines an important point in how to go about resolving doubts about other Dhamma teachings as well. Always make sure you have the context right. When you keep the Four Noble Truths foremost and can figure out how other teachings fit within those truths, you can see how the Dhamma makes strategic sense. Pondering in these ways, adopting the Four Noble Truths as the basic structure for your thinking about yourself, the world, and the path of practice is the ideal way to develop the discernment that comes from thinking things through. It's also the first stage in what the Buddha calls appropriate attention, which he cited as the foremost internal factor leading to awakening, ID 16. The next step in appropriate attention is to foster the discernment that comes from actually developing the qualities of your mind. You do that by following the duties appropriate to the Four Noble Truths, taking them as the basic framework for deciding how to act in thought, word, and deed. Thank you for your attention. We've reached the conclusion of Chapter 7, Exploring the Third Noble Truth, Chapter 8, delving into the fourth noble truth, and Chapter 9, Pondering the Truth. As you've learned, the Buddha ardently encourages the dissemination of his teachings for the betterment of all humanity. We've undertaken the challenging task of transforming this book into an audiobook, and now it's your turn to make a difference. Please share this video with your friends and family, allowing them to reap the same benefits. By subscribing, liking, and sharing, you can play an active role in spreading these teachings far and wide. Thank you for your support.